Indiana. Can you hear me okay in the back? I know there's so many people here. Thank you very much for coming. Anywhere else that you're here, so thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and read off this. I'll be very quick, I promise. Esteemed guests and fellow learners, welcome to today's speaker program, where we embark on a journey through history to uncover timeless leadership lessons. Today we have the distinct honor of hosting the Authority on Leadership and a fellow Texan, Talmage Boston. I'm from Texas, sorry. I always bring that up, sorry. As we gather here, poised to delve into the rich tapestry of presidential leadership, we invite you to open your minds and hearts to the wisdom that transcends generations. From the hallowed halls of the White House to the challenges faced on the world stage, we will explore the triumphs, trials, and tribulations of those who have held the highest office in the land. Through the keen insights of our speaker, Mr. Talmage Boston, we shall uncover invaluable lessons that resonate not only in the corridors of power, but also in our daily lives. So let us embark on this illuminating journey together as we seek to glean wisdom from the past to illuminate the path forward. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker and then our moderator, and then
that would be me.
Bring Talmage up here for some remarks. So our speaker, Talmage Boston, is a well-known figure among leading historians as an author, speaker, and on-stage interviewer. Boston is the author of Cross-Examining History, Raising the Bar, Baseball and the Baby Boomer, and 1939, Baseball's Tipping Point. He is also one of the most highly recognized lawyers in Texas, having been chosen for 3 major statewide awards in the last 4 years by the Texas Bar Foundation and the State Bar of Texas's litigation section. Boston has been named a Texas super lawyer by Thomson Lawyers every year since 2003, and among the best lawyers in America every year since 2013. He is the only lawyer to receive a presidential citation from 8 different presidents of the State Bar of Texas for outstanding service to the State Bar. Working as both a full-time commercial litigator and a full-time historian throughout the 21st century, Boston's varied experience and notable achievements in both fields make him uniquely qualified to write How the Best Did It, due to his knowledge of history, his skills as a writer, and his vast experience in business and law. In November 2023, Boston will be recognized by the Boston was recognized or will be recognized?
Was recognized.
By the Dallas Historical Society as the History Maker of the Year in the field of promoting history in North Texas. Boston lives in Dallas, Texas, with his wife Claire, son Scott, daughter Lindsay, son-in-law Mitchell, and grandson Nolan. Now I'd like to also welcome somebody you might know. Our esteemed moderator for today's discussion, Mr. Jerry Abramson, one of the most prominent politicians in Louisville history. Mr. Abramson holds several distinctions in city memory and politics. The first Jewish mayor of Louisville and the longest serving mayor in the city's history, earning him the local title, Mayor for Life. Throughout 3 decades of municipal government, Abramson's impact on Louisville has been profound, and his legacy endures in the modern landmarks, policies, and infrastructure of Kentucky's largest city. In 2011, he was elected Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky under Steve Beshear, and in 2014 was appointed Deputy Assistant to the President and the White House Director of Intergovernmental Affairs under President Barack Obama. We are so happy to have you all here with us. Thank you for coming, and I'll invite Mr. Boston to
Thank you, Brian. Very good. Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Good evening.
The good news is, since that introduction was written, we now have a second grandchild,
All right.
8 months old. It's a great thrill and pleasure to be here. I've been to Louisville before to speak to your bar association and your Kentucky State Bar Convention. And as a baseball fan, this being the home of the Louisville Slugger and so much rich sports history, and now Jerry told me today, it reminded me that SMU in Dallas is joining the Atlantic Coast Conference with Louisville, so you're going to be seeing Dallas people come up here for football and basketball games. So may our cities grow closer together. As Brian mentioned, I have a new book out. It came out April 2nd, titled How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. And I'm sure when you go to programs where a speaker is the author of a new book, your first question in your mind is, what led this guy to write that book? And so I'm going to answer that first. And the answer is, I've been a student of presidential history almost my entire life. As a child, as you could tell, my first two books that I wrote as an adult were baseball history books, but I fell in love with baseball. I was growing up in Houston. Houston Colt 45s came to Houston. The Astrodome was built. I collected baseball cards, and like all 6-year-olds, I had a sponge-like memory. I could remember anything, and all I was remembering, in my mother's eyes at least, was baseball statistics. She thought she had a real smart little boy, but all he knew about was baseball statistics. So as my 7th birthday approached, my mother went to a bookstore and found this booklet of presidential trading cards. And there was a card of each of the presidents, a wonderful picture on one side, on the back, when was he born, when he died, when was he president, what were the highlights of his life. And just as with the baseball cards, I memorized it all immediately and could recite in order all the presidents in the first grade. And so everybody thought I was the smartest kid in the world. All I'd done was do with presidential trading cards what I had done with baseball trading cards. But I fell deeply in love with baseball history in the 90s, and that led to my first 2 books. But when I was finished, I realized I'd written everything about baseball history that I really cared about, and I was ready to move on. So my 3rd book was about legal history. I've been a practicing lawyer for 46 years. And then the last 2 books have been about presidential history, which is really where my focus is and where I think it's going to stay for the rest of my life. And what actually led to this book, the book is dedicated to a man named David Stewart. David is like me in that he spent his career, for the most part, as a very fine lawyer in Washington, D.C., Yale Law School, clerk for Lewis Powell in the U.S. Supreme Court. But about 16 or 17 years ago, he woke up one day and said, what I really want to be is a historian. And so lo and behold, he wrote a book on the Constitutional Convention that Simon & Schuster published, and has written a number of wonderful books, and he and I have done a lot of programs together, become good friends. And his most recent book came out 3 years ago, was a biography of George Washington. And in it, he basically explained how George did it. How could somebody be chosen to lead the colonial army unanimously by the Continental Congress, be chosen to lead the Constitutional Convention unanimously to preside over the convention, and be chosen for both his first term and his second term unanimously as President of the United States. No one ever opposed him. How did he do it? And that's what David's book goes deep into. And as I read it, it's great. We all think about these guys on Mount Rushmore. We've heard these names all our lives. But have we ever really stopped and thought about how do they do it? And as I was reading about how Washington did it, I said, you know what? Anybody can do this if we just apply history to what we're trying to do. So I say the target audience for my book is not people who are just absorbed in presidential history. The target audience for my book is anybody who is or aspires to be a better leader. And so the theme of my book is that for each of my 8 greatest presidents, I identify what from all my research, decided were the 3 most, on the average, 3 most important leadership traits that president had that caused him to be so successful. That's what the book is about. And there's no duplication of traits. I mean, one of Washington's great traits that I talk about, for example, he had integrity, and therefore what he said had credibility. Well, obviously, I could have said exactly the same thing about Abraham Lincoln, but I don't think you want to read about 2 different chapters on integrity because it'd be repetitive. So the book contains a total of 24 leadership traits about our 8 greatest presidents. And I mentioned the word applying history. The guy who wrote my foreword, John Avalon, until 5 or 6 weeks ago, was the lead political analyst on CNN on the morning show. His wife is Margaret Hoover. You may have seen Margaret Hoover's firing line. She happens to be the great-granddaughter of Herbert Hoover. But anyway, John has written 2 wonderful presidential biographies, one on George Washington and most recent on Abraham Lincoln. And what he's trying to do is not only recite how interesting all these historical facts are, but how they can be used. And so that's what my book attempts to be. It's a work of applied history. And along those lines, at the end of each one of the 8 chapters, I have a series of questions for the reader, the aspiring leader, to ask him or herself, how am I doing in these traits that I just read about in the chapter on Washington? How am I doing in my integrity/credibility? How am I doing in learning from mistakes? How am I doing in unifying my company when friction arises with factions within it? And so that's the outline. But another important component is I was thinking about doing this book. A friend of mine named Mark Updegrove, who's the former head of the LBJ Library and is currently the head of the LBJ Foundation and has written a number of wonderful presidential history books. He said, Talmage, you cannot put these guys on pedestals. You in each chapter, you have to not only talk about their great leadership traits, you have to talk about their flaws. And so in each chapter, there is a section on their flaws. I'm not going to pretend that these guys were perfect, even Abraham Lincoln. And so anyway, that's the way the book is set up and what inspired me to write it. I wanted to bring it out in a presidential election year. I had no idea that the presidential parties, the candidates would turn out to be who they are, which is we don't exactly have Abraham Lincoln running in this year's election. In terms of how I went about my process, as Brian mentioned, I'm still a full-time lawyer, which means to keep my day job, my vocation, I didn't have time to go to every presidential library and dig through all the old letters and read the cursive handwriting and figure all that stuff out. And I didn't need to, because all that's been done by prior historians, prior biographers of each of these 8 presidents. These 8 presidents are well covered in the history community. Abe Lincoln has over 16,000 books that have been written about him. He's second only to Jesus Christ. And so what I did, my process was that for each of these 8 presidents, I read the top 6 to 8 biographies of each. And, obviously distilled them. I was looking for that particular biographer's conclusion, what made George Washington, what were the specific traits, all of them. And amazingly, there wasn't much conflict. They were pretty much in agreement. So they just kind of, the more I read, the more it seemed like they were basically all pretty much saying the same things. So anyway, you may ask, well, how did you come up with choosing your 8 top presidents? And the answer is, I largely followed the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll. Anytime a president leaves the White House and a new one comes in, C-SPAN does a poll of the country's 150 leading historians and asks each of them to rank best to worst, all of them, based on 10 presidential leadership traits. You can Google C-SPAN presidential ranking poll and read about the last several polls and how each of them was ranked and so on and so forth. The last 2 polls, one was in 2017 when Obama left the presidency and Trump came in, and the most recent was 2021 when Trump went out and Biden came in, and the results of both of those polls were identical. Number 1, the best, chosen by the historians, Lincoln. Number 2, Washington. Number 3, FDR. Number 4, Theodore Roosevelt. Number 5, Dwight Eisenhower. Number 6, Harry Truman. Number 7, Jefferson. Number 8, Kennedy. Number 9, Reagan. So the only tweak that I made to the C-SPAN poll was, I think Harry Truman is overrated and I think Reagan is underrated. So I pulled Truman out. I moved Reagan up 1. Number 1, I think in 2024, people are more interested in reading about Reagan than they are Truman. But most importantly, I'm trying to sell my book to Democrats and Republicans. And in the modern era, I wanted to have 2 great Democratic presidents and 2 great Republican presidents. FDR and JFK, Democrat, Eisenhower and Reagan, Republican. And in this era of extreme polarization, I wanted to convey the message that I want Republicans to recognize we've had truly great Democratic presidents, and I want Democrats to recognize that we've had truly great Republican presidents. So that's part of it as well. If I had a ninth president, it surely would have been Harry Truman. And then the last thing I want to say before Jerry and I start talking, you may say, well, why should I rely upon or believe in the conclusions of a Dallas lawyer about presidential history? I mean, he's not a full-time historian. He's not won the Pulitzer Prize. And my answer to the question is, don't believe me. Believe the people who are the country's leading presidential historians, each of whom I know personally because I do all these on-stage interviews. Whenever they have new books, they come through Dallas and I interview them and do programs with them. And every time I would finish a chapter that was truly finished, my final draft, I would send it to at least 2 major biographers of that president and say, here it is. Did I miss something? Did I misstate something? Is there something that needs to be clarified that isn't? And I got their feedback. And I incorporated that into my final draft. And hopefully when this program's over, you're going to be so inspired that you're going to want to go out and buy that book. And you'll notice that on the back, on the front, endorsement, Pulitzer winner John Meacham, basically endorsing the whole book. On the back, you'll see one of those major biographers of each of the 8 who is endorsing that chapter. And so hopefully that would give you, and in the acknowledgments, I identify the other presidential biographers besides those on the dust jacket who read my chapters and gave me the feedback, and which gives me, it's always great when you're asking for a second opinion, and the second opinion comes back and says, I agree with you. I mean, that's a good feeling. And so that was my process, just to give myself confidence that what I was holding out is exactly how the best did it. Leadership lessons from our top presidents. It wasn't just Talmage Boston talking. It was the opinion that was accepted by the country's leading presidential historians. So that's the background on why I wrote the book, how I wrote the book, and why I feel very confident about the conclusions drawn. So now I'm looking forward to my conversation with Jerry Abramson.
All right. That was great.
Thank you.
That was very, very good.
Thank you.
Okay. Am I on? Nope. Yes? No? No. What do I do?
Little power button right at the bottom. Hold that guy down.
Okay.
Just a second.
It's on the left.
Now
It's
you're
on the left. Power it down. Here, you take
lights
that.
on.
There you
Make
go.
sure everybody else. Yeah, you're good.
Beautiful.
Well, first let me say it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with Talmage. I read the book.
That was
That's
inevitable.
good. That's pretty
I'm about
good.
to drop the microphone.
I read the book, and I can tell you it is excellent. It is made me think a lot, maybe reminded myself of issues that I wish I had read the book before I handled them in my public service. It's awfully nice to hear and be with a highly recognized attorney from the state of Texas. I am one of the least recognized attorneys in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. But it is a book that really makes you think. And it's the kind of book that if you're in one of those positions looking to be a leader, you got to read. But if you got a kid or a grandkid who's hoping he or she is going to be able to move into that position, it's a book to be read and to be thought about. I asked Talmage earlier, I said, how'd you pick the 8 presidents, as he explained to you how he picked them? Because I, too, wondered about Truman. And I also wondered, as I Googled all sorts of lists, about LBJ, who I and a lot of my friends took to the streets, not particularly in support of during the Vietnam era. But certainly, when you stop and think and set that one issue aside, there were an awful lot of really positive things that he did for this country. You know, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. He expanded it, and it goes on and on and on. Civil rights and education, but he didn't make the list.
And just a quick answer. I mentioned the 2017 poll, and Reagan was 9th, and LBJ was 10th.
Oh.
And in the 2021 poll, Reagan was 9th. To my surprise, and I think the surprise of a lot of people, Barack Obama was 10th, and LBJ was 11th.
I'm not surprised.
But yeah, that's right. You're the Obama
I spent 2.5 years there.
There you go. But the short answer is that as many fabulous things that LBJ did in civil rights and so many other areas, you can't get over Vietnam. And that's not just a little blip or a little mistake, or that was a glaring foreign policy catastrophe that split the country and ultimately became the war we lost. But more importantly than that, and when I look at Vietnam, and I'm sure you've thought this too, Jerry, I'm glad I wasn't president during Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was a morass. It was something that could not be figured out in real time by anyone with any conviction. And so I'm willing to be forgiving, because to think that, oh, he should have figured out Vietnam and known exactly what to do, and we wouldn't have lost 55,000 lives and all that kind of stuff. But where I think the real trouble is that history is quite clear that throughout the Vietnam, he was lying to the American people. And that was a huge factor that caused people to basically throw him out of office. If you've read Julia Zweig's biography of Lady Bird, and of course any of the biographies on LBJ, he couldn't sleep at night, his family couldn't sleep at night, all the protesters and so forth were screaming wherever he went, including outside the White House. And so that was the fact that the war was unpopular, but also that it was becoming clear that the president had not spoken accurately to the American people about what was going on. And so that's why I applaud, like you, Jerry, all the great things that LBJ did, particularly in the civil rights, but I can't get past Vietnam.
It's interesting, and we'll move on quickly, but I take the Lyndon Johnson presidency as the point in time where we as Americans went from believing our country was right until proven wrong to no longer believing that, but in fact being skeptical and questioning as to whether they were right until proven right. And that was a really crucial point in time.
No doubt.
And that was a heck of a swing in terms of the mindset of Americans as a result, I think, I would submit, in terms of Lyndon Johnson. Well, I've got, of the 24, 25 traits, characteristics that are throughout the book, I narrowed it down to 5. And so let's talk about them, and I'll let you take a swing at it, and I'll try to fill in behind you if need be. The first one that came to my mind was a trait that said you got to learn from your mistakes, and you got to be decisive in your decision making. Learn from your mistakes. I mean, the obvious one is John F. Kennedy. He came into office, didn't know what was going on. Next thing you know, they're telling him we should go into Cuba. He goes into Cuba. It was half baked, half whatever, and he learned his lesson. Next time the Joint Chiefs of Staff came to him and said, "We need to go into Laos," John F. Kennedy said, "No, I've learned my lesson. Now let's go back through and let's see where we are." That's one that comes to mind, but you have quite a few throughout your book.
Well, that's an extremely important one, though. Kennedy had been president for 3 months when the Bay of Pigs fiasco came down. And the mistake he made was he rubber stamped, accepted the advice of so-called experts who said, oh, this is going to work. We've got 1,400 insurgents who our CIA has been training in Guatemala and Nicaragua. And they're going to go into the Bay of Pigs and say, we're here to overthrow Castro. And because there are so many Cuban people who don't want Castro as their leader, they are immediately going to rise up and lock arms with these 1,400 insurgents, and by golly, they're going to overthrow Castro. And our CIA believed that that was going to happen. And our Joint Chiefs of Staff thought that was going to happen. And so Kennedy said, well, and Kennedy, before he was president, had really not been a foreign policy thinker during his 14 years in Congress. So he said, okay, well, that's what you guys think will work. And even though Dean Acheson, who had been Harry Truman's Secretary of State, came in, and Kennedy said, okay, well, here's what we're about to do, and tell me what you think of it. And Dean Acheson said, wait a second, there's 1,400 insurgents, and Castro has an army of 25,000 on the ground who are ready to respond to their invasion. You don't have to work at Price Waterhouse to know that this ain't gonna work. But Acheson was no longer the Secretary of State, and so Kennedy said yes, and he did it. But to Jerry's point, lesson learned. I'm not gonna rubber stamp accept the advice of experts. And that was crucially important when the Cuban Missile Crisis arose in October 1962. And the good thing about that was that during the 13 days and a total of 42 hours of conversations among Kennedy's, quote, executive committee, which was his cabinet, top advisors, Joint Chiefs of Staff, was recorded. And so we have a clear record of who was saying what. And the Kennedy brothers, who were the only people who knew it was recorded, thought that these recordings would always be their personal property. They wanted to have a recording so that when the time came to write their memoirs, that they'd have access to it. Well, of course, after U.S. v. Nixon, those recordings were not their personal property or the property of the Kennedy family or the Kennedy Library. They were the property of the United States government. And so in the 1990s, when these recordings were made available to scholars for the first time and people could actually hear the voices, hear the conversations, the dialogue that led to the ultimate decisions, they realized there was one calm head in the room, there was one clear-thinking leader, and that all these other people, including Bobby Kennedy, were hawkish, were saying we need to invade Cuba, we need to bomb Cuba, which obviously would have started World War III and have a nuclear holocaust. And so that is an incredibly important example of learning from your mistakes. Now, in the Washington chapter, I identified that he learned from his mistakes. His first real military experience was fighting on behalf of the British Army in the French and Indian War. And young George was ambitious, wanted to rise to the top, wanted to achieve distinction early on in life. And so he became this very aggressive, obnoxious self-promoter, always trying to get a higher rank, leaning on people, going around people's back, trying to get promoted. And he failed time and time again. Lesson learned. For the rest of his life, nobody ever thought of him as a self-promoter. He became more tactful, could see better ways to impress others besides blowing his own horn. Another example was Franklin Roosevelt, a glaring mistake early in his second term when he tried to pack the Supreme Court, and that was thrown out, an incredibly embarrassing loss. It looked like he was trying to gain too much power, but he learned his lesson, and he stepped back, and he realized, no, I am going to have to abide by the Constitution. I don't have that kind of power. And in no time, when he took that arrogant assertion of power attitude away, he became that much more popular among the American people. So great leaders learn from their mistakes, and that's certainly true of some of our top presidents.
You know, in your book, you also focus on Lincoln and you know, McClellan to Grant, and you know, the mistakes that he made in terms of selecting his leaders based on this, that, or whatever. And then the next thing you know, he finally makes the move to Grant to lead the forces.
Well, and that's a great point in that, you know, Lincoln had less than 1 year of formal schooling, and he had never been in combat. He had been something of a militiaman during the Black Hawk War, but he never had any combat. So now all of a sudden we got a civil war on our hands after the firing at Fort Sumter. And so you have these people like George McClellan who are honor graduates from West Point. And Lincoln figures, well, these guys must know how to fight a war. And so whatever they recommend in terms of what we ought to do, I'm going to accept their advice. Kind of like Kennedy did with early in his presidency. Well, it turns out McClellan academically knew how to fight a war, but in terms of what was here, he didn't want to fight. He was a coward. He wouldn't get his troops to fight. So Lincoln, who didn't go to West Point, but he said, we got to win this war, and it's not looking like these West Point guys are going to be able to lead us to victory. So he goes to the Library of Congress and studies up on military history and military tactics, and realizes this is how we need to fight a war, which leads to him replacing McClellan and ultimately coming up with U.S. Grant, who was a West Point grad, but he'd been kind of in the bottom of his class. McClellan's the top. But anyway, I don't know that you could say at the outset of a presidency where you didn't go to West Point, you never thought that it was, quote, a mistake to pick McClellan. He was the most logical person. And until you get into the heat of battle and find out whether somebody's got fire in his belly and courage and all those things you need to be a successful general, you can't know in advance. But once that became clear, then Lincoln did what it took to rethink how we're going to fight this war, how we're going to win this war. And because he ultimately became what I consider a military genius as well as a political genius, and before that a legal genius, and that's why he's number one, he ultimately led the Union to win the Civil War.
The second characteristic that I pulled out of the book was a focus on principled pragmatism, which is really reality versus idealism. I mean, you want your leaders to have an idealistic approach and a vision, as was said today, the vision thing, but you also have to have a leader who understands the reality of what is and the opportunity to change it over time rather than immediately if that happens to be the issue. I read the Thomas Jefferson section, first off the bat, focusing on his understanding that he had to work with the Federalists. He wasn't a Federalist, he had to work with the Federalists. He had to make deals, he had to do compromises, because there was a difference between the ideal and the real. And I'll let Talmage talk a little bit about some of the folks that were in that trait or that characteristic.
Well, Jefferson's predecessor was John Adams, and Adams was a Federalist, and during his one term, Congress was controlled by the Federalists. And during that term, the Federalists passed the Sedition Act, which made it a crime punishable by incarceration for anyone to criticize the President, Adams, or any Federalist policy. And so, in fact, people were thrown in jail for exercising their freedom of speech and freedom of the press rights to criticize what was going on politically. Fortunately, the Sedition Act expired by its terms at the end of Adams' presidency, but that was the nation that Jefferson was becoming president of, such that in his first inaugural address, and this was an interesting fact, in Thomas Jefferson's 8 years of presidency, he gave a grand total of 2 speeches, his 2 inaugural addresses. But in that first inaugural addresses, he basically opened by saying, look, folks, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, i.e., we're all Americans, and if we don't start finding ways to work together, this brand new country is not going to last. Now, Jefferson knew he was not a great public speaker, and that's why he didn't give speeches. But what he was great at was building relationships with adversaries that over time, you don't do it in one conversation, you don't do it in one dinner party, but throughout his presidency, 2 to 3 times every week, he would have a dinner party, with between 8 and 20 people, Federalists, Republicans. One rule: we're not going to talk about the hot button issues. We're going to talk about history, we're going to talk about music, we're going to talk about literature, we're going to talk about what you do for a living, we're going to talk about family, we're going to drink lots of wine, we're going to eat great food, i.e., we're going to essentially become friends. And there's an adage that if somebody likes you, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And if they don't, they won't. Another adage, politics is all about relationships. And so Thomas Jefferson was a relentless relationship builder, and as Jerry said, broke down the walls over time through these dinners, not one a month, 2 to 3 times a week, just relentless relationship builder. But on the other issue of Jefferson's principled pragmatism, the most dramatic example was his decision to acquire the Louisiana Purchase. Because originally he thought for the United States, as he read the Constitution, the only way we could make this kind of acquisition was if we passed a constitutional amendment. But he realized that that process then and now is very complicated, very time consuming, and if he went that route, which he thought was required, Napoleon might change his mind and the deal would go away and we would lose the greatest real estate deal in the history of the country, doubling the size of our country. And so, principled pragmatism, I'm not going to let this deal get away. And so he backed off on insisting that we got to have a constitutional amendment, and he got it done. And obviously, the Louisiana Purchase, one of the greatest things in our history, but certainly one of the greatest things in Jefferson's presidency.
Yeah, I agree. And your section on Thomas Jefferson, I thought was really special.
Thank you.
How about a trait that shows up in Lincoln and Washington and Eisenhower and Teddy Roosevelt, this collaborative decision making? I mean, most folks have read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on the team of rivals. And so, obviously, Lincoln felt you get your rivals, you get them in close. But there are an awful lot of others within this book that focuses on their understanding, including Eisenhower, who had been through it, obviously, and leading the forces and ultimately signing off on D-Day and all that he went through. He did a lot. Your book says he did an enormous amount of listening in the cabinet meetings, asking the questions in the cabinet meetings. He knew he was going to make the decision. No major, no colonel, he'd been there in the military. It wasn't going to be called by a sergeant. It was going to be called by him with the ultimate decision. But Eisenhower seemed to be a man that really understood the importance of collaboration.
Well, when you're the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, and you have these generals and armies from different countries, you've got to figure out an effective system of organization, and in particular, how that organization is going to work. And so in my Eisenhower chapter, this is the first trait I identified, that he took that same organizational skill that he had had in World War II and had used effectively and brought it to the White House. He had worked closely with FDR and Harry Truman as the presidents during the time he was the Supreme Allied Commander. And he was extremely unimpressed with how they had organized their staff and how the government ran. And so Eisenhower implemented a whole new approach to how he used his cabinet, such that the cabinet met every single Friday, and Eisenhower was always there. And one of the rules was nobody can bring up an issue about just his department. We're going to talk about the big issues. Here's all these smart guys, captains of industries, leaders. I want your brain power. I want to brainstorm with you. As Jerry said, Eisenhower is the ultimate decision maker. But I want to get all that input, which was basically exactly what Abraham Lincoln had done with his team of rivals. But one of my favorite examples of collaborative decision making, people ask me, okay, you've identified all these traits for these 8 different guys. Are there any common traits among that all the 8 had? And I say 3. 1, as great leaders, they were all great persuaders, although they all went about persuading in his own unique way. 2, because they actually wanted to achieve something during their presidency instead of getting it gridlocked. They directed all their initiatives to the great middle, the great American middle, and not to the extremes. But 3rd, they all had a high sense of self-awareness. That is, they knew their strengths and they knew their weaknesses. And so on that line, George Washington is the perfect example. George Washington knew he was a great military leader, political leader, decision maker, but he knew he was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, IQ-wise. And so, but he was also smart enough to figure out who the really brilliant people were. So for example, when he's preparing to go to the Constitutional Convention, and he knows, like all conventions where you're attempting to create this grand, important, nation-changing document, it's really helpful to start with a first draft as opposed to starting from scratch when the convention starts. Well, if you're going to create a first draft of how this brand new country should be run and operated and laws and so forth, you need to have a deep history. Deep knowledge of political history to know kind of what's worked and what hadn't worked. Washington knew, I don't have that, but James Madison does. So James Madison, why don't you come up with what became known as the Virginia Plan, which became the ultimate backbone of the Constitution. Similarly, during his presidency, we've got all these post-war debts. We've got to come up with a brand new national fiscal policy, economic policy. That wasn't Washington's forte. He hadn't done that kind of sophisticated economic analysis, but Alexander Hamilton had, who he chose to be a Secretary of the Treasury. And so he delegated that to Hamilton, and getting to this idea of collaboration, Washington was always in an information gathering mode, such that when there was division between what Hamilton wanted on one issue compared to what Jefferson wanted, Washington would insist that each of them prepare a written position paper and give to him for him to read and reflect on, so on, strongly considering both sides before he, the president, would make a final decision. Now, in order to look at being president that way and to recognize, hey, Madison's smarter than me on this, and Hamilton's smarter than me on this, you have to have a fundamental humility. You have to know it would be ridiculous for me to micromanage everything. And so, because of that humility, it's tied to his self-awareness as to what he knew he was good at and what he knew he wasn't. That inspired this desire to collaborate so that he could get these great minds working for him, and he wouldn't be trying to make decisions that he knew he really wasn't qualified to make. So I love the story of how Washington went about using the people around him, just like I do Lincoln, just like I do Eisenhower.
I guess that's how you get elected unopposed. Anyway. I was thinking about your section on Teddy Roosevelt in that same area. I mean, he was the Energizer Bunny, this guy. And yet, he was focused on ultimately understanding his role as a mediator.
Well, he was definitely a great collaborator as far as mediation went. I don't know how many in this audience understand exactly what a mediation is, but basically it's when two sides are at war, and these days it's typically two sides on opposite sides of a lawsuit, and they can't settle things. And so they bring in a neutral mediator whose job it is not to say, oh, you're going to win, you're going to lose, your position is strong, your position is weak. No. The mediator is basically an agent of reality to challenge people about their positions, and then brainstorm possible paths to settlement and get people finally to agree to something that can result in a settlement. And so Theodore Roosevelt had been president for 1 year when all of a sudden there was the great coal strike of 1902. No American president had ever been involved in a labor dispute before. And yet here was this coal strike going on month after month after month. No progress was made. Winter is approaching. And half of the country is going to freeze to death because they don't have coal unless we find a way to end this coal strike. And so Theodore Roosevelt brings in the parties, the coal miners and the coal company owners, and talks and brainstorms and thinks if possible, and finally gets them to agree on binding arbitration. They agree on it. The results are accepted. No cold strike, nobody freezes to death. His reputation to be able to do this so well as a mediator soon spread. And a couple years later, Japan and Russia were at war. And they said, hey, President Roosevelt, you think you could settle this the way you did the cold strike? He said, I'll give it a shot. And of course, he settled it. And for it, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And then he did it in the Moroccan crisis and a Hague Convention crisis. So that's a collaboration effort. But Roosevelt was this, as you mentioned, electric personality, dominating personality. You didn't want to cross Theodore Roosevelt. And when he's saying, you need to do this, you need to agree to this, and had that, he was likable. People warmed up to him. But it was this force of personality, one-on-one. And Jerry, I'm sure you've been involved in mediations, that caused people to get real. Get off your high horse, get off your ideals. This is the real world. We've got to sort this out. And if we don't, it's going to be a disaster. And get people to recognize that. And Theodore Roosevelt was a master.
Teddy Roosevelt was the first presidential candidate to campaign. You had talked about that in your book. He was given 30 speeches a day out there on the hustings from the back of the railroads. In fact, here in Louisville, over at the Barrett and Lexington Road Railroad overpass, that's where the trains would stop with the presidential candidates, and they'd close the streets and we'd be down on the street, and that's where they would speak from during the era of that individual. He first one to really campaign, and a real, as I said, energizer.
But there's some good word pictures that go along with that. Roosevelt was electric, high-strung, high energy, and before each of those speeches off the back of the train, to get his energy level up, and if you're going to give a speech, you've got to have high energy level. If you don't have that, you're going to bore your audience. He would get on the back of the train and he would shadow box and just work himself up physically so that he'd be ready to give that speech. And in his day, in the White House, they had a tennis court. And he would go out there and play tennis all day long, 91 games in one day. And he wasn't a great tennis player, but he loved to play. And when he would make an occasional good shot, he would jump up and down. You're playing 91 games and you still have the energy to jump up and down. He started every morning drinking a gallon of coffee and eating 12 eggs. So it's one thing to have all this electricity. On the other hand, as I talk about in the book, getting back to the flaws, he ultimately burned himself out. He left the presidency at the age of 50. He had come in when McKinley was shot at age 42, the youngest president ever. Kennedy was the youngest president elected at age 43. But he left the White House at age 50. 10 years later, he's dead at age 60. And the last decade of his life is kind of a downward spiral. He made one bad decision after another because he just had overloaded himself physically, mentally. The good news is that while he was still at the top of his game, that was during his presidential years. That's why he's ranked number 4 and why we enjoy reading about his presidency. But you read about the last 10 years of his life, and it's a very sad story.
Let's talk about the use of the bully pulpit among the 8. That sun is in your eyes. Is there a way to close off we don't know.
Yeah,
Okay.
I
I just felt badly for you. The bully pulpit. We haven't talked much about Ronald Reagan, but he certainly was an inspirational speaker, a person who wanted very much to bring an optimistic, positive feel for the American people, and created an opportunity, I think, to sort of restore faith in the government and in folks, in Americans, in being Americans. We'd gone through some difficult times. He had some difficult issues when he was governor, but he really had that opportunity of using that bully pulpit. And when he fired all the air traffic controllers, I mean, that was the ultimate bully pulpit. that he wasn't going to stand for the kind of reaction, or the kind of action that took place by government employees. And he seemed to be one of the best, most articulate, focused presidents we've had.
Yeah, I mean, his nickname, you'll recall, was the Great Communicator. But one of the most fun things about my research in the Reagan chapter was to realize that his great hero for most of his life was Franklin Roosevelt. He voted for Franklin Roosevelt in all 4 elections. And historian H.W. Brand says what Franklin Roosevelt was for the first half of the 20th century, Reagan was for the second half. And then Richard Reeves in his biography says what Franklin Roosevelt was to liberals, Reagan was to conservatives. But this same eloquence, both in terms of oratory to the masses, but also this calm conversational delivery in fireside chats and radio addresses, but to be able to put into words what most Americans were thinking. And of course, Reagan became president immediately after the disastrous presidency of Jimmy Carter. Double-digit inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth, long gasoline lines, and we couldn't rescue the hostages from Iran. And by Carter's own statements, we had a state of national malaise, and we needed an optimist to turn the country around and restore its self-confidence, and also with the vision, the long-term vision that Reagan had toward defeating communism and ultimately winning the Cold War, that he followed through on with the bully pulpit, not only to the people, but over time in his relationship with Gorbachev, to get him to come around and slowly but surely see things Reagan's way and realize that because the Russian economy was in the process of failing, and because of Reagan's effective use of the Strategic Defense Initiative nicknamed Star Wars, which scared the heck out of the Russians. They thought, we can't possibly compete with that, even though it was still just an idea. We never actually put Star Wars together. But it scared the Russians enough, and their economy was failing enough that they all of a sudden became a lot more negotiable, ultimately led to the treaty by which all intermediate missiles were withdrawn. So an important leader in bringing down the threat of nuclear proliferation because of not only how he communicated to people, but to other government leaders.
And FDR, you mentioned the fireside chat. I mean, he had a nation that was going under. I mean, the Depression had hit in such a way that he's on there trying to keep people's hopes alive while he's trying to set up, food kitchens for them to have food for themselves and their families. He's trying to, as that was getting a little better, he's trying to get the American people through fireside chats and speeches that he gave ready for entry into World War II that he ultimately felt was necessary. Couldn't get the country there. We'll talk a little bit about getting out ahead of your skis, but he understood the country wasn't ready, but through his radio and speeches, he was able to do just that.
Right. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, when Hitler's reign of terror was going on, most Americans were still locked into isolationism. Post-World War I, we don't want to go halfway around the world and fight another war and lose tens of thousands of people. We want to stay home. And Franklin Roosevelt was smart enough to say, that won't work because this Hitler guy is serious. And if we don't do anything, Europe isn't able to defend itself against Hitler. He's going to take over Europe. He's going to take over Asia. He's going to take over Africa, Australia, and the high seas, and then he'll come here. And so we can't just wait around for Hitler to be emboldened and more aggressive and ultimately want to attack the United States. But he knew that if he said, just like Lincoln at the outset of his presidency wasn't advocating abolitionism, at the start of his presidency, he was merely saying, I just don't want slavery to extend to the West. I'm not saying we're going to abolish slavery. I'm trying to hold the country together, but I don't want more slavery in the West. Well, and so over time, over his 4 years, slowly but surely, he brought the country around such that within 4 years, the 13th Amendment gets passed and slavery is abolished. but it was a series of incremental developments, including, most importantly in the middle of it, the Emancipation Proclamation, which happens to be on my tie. But Franklin Roosevelt, slowly but surely, would say things in these fireside chats, like he knew people didn't want to hear about war and American soldiers going to war, and so he would say, this is not my remarks on war, but I am going to be talking about national security. That was less threatening, but every bit as important for people to need to respond to. And then as Hitler became more and more aggressive, he would say, look, folks, you've got an atlas. You can see the world, and you can figure out where Hitler is, and you can read about the power of these weapons he's got, and he's headed this way, and we can't let him get a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And so people looked at their atlas and read about that and said, you know, he's right. So ultimately, he got the country to unstick itself in isolationism and move toward an attitude, we got to do what we got to do to stop Hitler and bring this to an end. But it was incremental for Lincoln and for FDR.
Okay, and the last one, because I want to leave 10 minutes or so for questions, and I'm getting all the, come on. I want to focus on never get ahead of your citizenry, never get too far over your skis. And, George Washington, the way Talmage lays it out, was, he would listen. I always tell kids when I speak to them, there's a reason why God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. We're supposed to be listening more than we're talking. And he would do that. He would let the issue percolate. And the one example you give is the example of Hamilton wanted to do something about the state debts and the national bank and all that. Jefferson didn't want that. Jefferson wanted to have the capital of the United States somewhere near Virginia. Hamilton didn't particularly want that. He was sort of an Eastern guy. And, ultimately, letting it percolate, not getting too far ahead of your constituents, George Washington stepped up and said, well, why don't we do both? Hamilton, you do this, we'll take the District of Columbia and create it. And the next thing you know, that waiting, that patience, and there's other examples of that, but that one hit me pretty strong, I thought.
Well, very definitely. And in terms of this incremental step-by-step approach, it's interesting to see how Kennedy dealt with Khrushchev step by step, and how Reagan, as I mentioned, dealt with Gorbachev. And it all is tied back to the point we made about Thomas Jefferson. If you start building relationships with people, trying to move them to where you want them to go, whether it's Washington with Hamilton and Jefferson, or Kennedy with Khrushchev, or Reagan with Gorbachev, again, they gotta like you. They've got to want to make something work. And so to see how, after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Khrushchev totally disrespected Kennedy at the Vienna summit shortly thereafter. But Kennedy stood up to him on Berlin, and then particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, this clear mutual respect, and thank God, both of them were smart enough to know, whatever we do, let's not have World War III. Whatever we do, let's not have a nuclear holocaust. Let's figure out a way to make a deal that we can both live with, that's going to stop before we get to this next potentially fatal step. And it was because of the way they had developed their relationship over time. And during Kennedy's presidency, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the first nuclear test ban treaty, because of the way he had kept moving things along with Khrushchev toward where he wanted it to go.
And real quickly, the other one that jumped out at me was the Eisenhower example of don't get too far out ahead. I mean, Brown versus Board of Education was decided 1954, as I remember. The country wasn't, certainly the South wasn't particularly interested in following suit. Lots of things were going on to sort of step around, step over, step under. And you didn't see Ike doing much until literally there was a movement that occurred with Governor Faubus down in Arkansas, and the Little Rock Central High School, as I remember, in Little Rock,
Yes, yes,
Arkansas. And the next thing you know, Eisenhower acted and sent the federal government in, much like John F. Kennedy, who again didn't do really much, talked a little bit about it when he wanted to be vice president, as you said, but when he became president, he didn't do much, and then all of a sudden Birmingham happened, Bull Connor's on television nationwide, people are being sprayed with fire hoses, and the next thing you know, John F. Kennedy responds and sends in troops. So in both those situations, Eisenhower and JFK, they waited, they were patient. I don't know if they were patient, they were just...
Well, no, in fact, Eisenhower was patient. He didn't want to send the army into Little Rock. He tried to make a deal with Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, and thought he had. And yet Faubus reneged on it, and so they were still blocking the entry for the Little Rock Nine. And so ultimately Eisenhower had no choice, but he knew that there were federal court orders that absolutely required that these students be permitted to enter the little Central High School. And that's just part of being president. You've got to enforce the law in a situation like that. Eisenhower was no grand champion of civil rights, but in that era, neither was Lyndon Johnson. Neither was John F. Kennedy. That didn't come until after Birmingham, where you see fire hoses blasted on black children and attack dogs unleashed on black adults. And certain things had to happen to awaken the American conscience that this whole issue of civil rights was not a political issue, it was a moral issue. And the light bulb finally went on with Kennedy, which caused him to submit the first strong civil rights bill, which a few months later he dies, and thank goodness Lyndon Johnson has the legislative wherewithal to get it to the goal line, and it becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But this is, presidents are strong when they need to be, and never weak, and never waffly. They're decisive, to your original point, Jerry. And that's what this book shows, that anybody who's aspiring to be a great leader, you've got to make a firm decision and enforce it, and not let it get away from you, because the consequences are, the conclusion will be, oh, he's weak. He's not going to get serious about this, and so nothing good happens.
How about questions from the audience? We've got about 10, 12 minutes if you have any questions. If not, I've got more questions.
Okay, here we go.
Oh.
I have a question. When Jerry and you were talking about the first point of relying on advisors and making mistakes, not making a mistake twice, it runs through a lot of the topics you covered. What is, in your book, is there a role of a confidant, someone that presidents consistently find they can rely on beyond that infrastructure of generals and advisors and secretaries of state? Do you find that to be a trait?
Absolutely. But typically the confidants are, for the most part, cabinet members or so forth. For example, Washington would not only preside over cabinet meetings, he'd have private conversations with Hamilton to talk about the economy, Jefferson to talk about foreign policy. The one example that comes to mind to your question, Eisenhower's closest confidant was his brother, Milton Eisenhower, who was the president of Kansas State University and another major university, I don't remember what it was. So he was kind of his outside the circle advisor. Kennedy's closest advisor was Ted Sorensen, who was his lead speechwriter, and who actually is the person who wrote Profiles in Courage, for which John F. Kennedy received the Pulitzer Prize. Reagan was a disconnected, he was again, like his hero, Franklin Roosevelt. They both had what one historian calls heavily forested interiors, such that they were never really transparent and revealing like you would be with a trusted advisor. And so, yes to your question for some presidents, but not for all of them.
Any other questions? There's one there.
Our planetarium friend back here. Astronomy.
This is an Earth-based question. You talked about faults. We all have faults. We're all human beings. And so can you talk about some of the faults of these leaders and how they at least kept in check or overcame them?
Well, the presidents who stand out the most for their faults, first of all, Thomas Jefferson. We all now know about what was going on at Monticello with Sally Hemings, with whom he fathered 7 children. I think 5 lived to be adults. And whether that was consensual or not, of course, she was a slave. That's what you call a pretty glaring fault. Theodore Roosevelt's faults really didn't come to light until after his presidency, but they were serious. In terms of faults, for example, Franklin Roosevelt, he was an absentee parent. So he had all these children and didn't do what fathers typically do. He had 5 children. Among the 5, they had 18 marriages. And his daughter, who was one, was actually arranging his get-togethers with Lucy Mercer, his former lover, during the last 2 years of his presidency, behind her mother's back. So it said Lucy Mercer was with FDR at Warm Springs when he died, and Eleanor, wherever she was, says, "Oh my God, he's back with Lucy Mercer, and she's with him, and my daughter set it up?" I mean, Kennedy, obviously his faults, we all know about the wild and crazy sex, and all the many different women. He was a serial philanderer. We all probably know about his extreme drug use with Dr. Feelgood's. And as I go into detail in the chapter, he and his family and in the Kennedy Presidential Library were actively involved in trying to manipulate the facts, in particular the Cuban Missile Crisis, to make him the great hero. And then after he was killed, Bobby took the initiative to make himself the great hero, when in fact he wasn't. Bobby had been a hawk advocating bombing and invasion. It was his brother John who kept a cool head, wanted to pursue the blockade, and so forth. Of course, Reagan was always flying at 50,000 feet, big picture vision. He was not a detail guy. And because of that, we had the Iran-Contra scandal, where he basically let his national security advisor go rogue. And ultimately, Reagan was essentially cleared of not being an active participant in doing what was done, which was in clear violation of the federal law. But because he's the president, therefore the commander-in-chief, he had to take responsibility. And he said, "I screwed up." And essentially, back to Jerry's point on the Bay of Pigs, when the Bay of Pigs fiasco came down, and it was this international humiliation, John F. Kennedy, to his credit, goes on national TV and says, "I'm the president, I'm the commander-in-chief. This was a horrible screw-up. We never should have done it. I'm responsible. I'll take the blame." And his approval ratings went up because he accepted responsibility even after this international disaster. So Ken Burns likes to call this component of studying history and the people involved and recognizing and talking about their flaws as emotional archaeology. It makes them real people. They were sinners. They screwed up. And yet, and you know, I could write, and some people say, "Why don't you write your next book, how the worst did it?" And we should avoid doing what our worst American president. I don't want to spend 2 years researching our worst presidents. And so the thrust of this book is on their most important leadership traits that caused them to be successful. But I do discuss, and in some chapters more than other, the flaws. I mean, Eisenhower, read about what was going on with his full knowledge with the CIA, particularly in Central and South America, and plots to assassinate, and in the Congo. It's pretty disturbing stuff, but it didn't really create any major problems because people didn't fully understand it till later. I guess I do want to tell you a story which is unrelated to the question, but it's such a good story I don't want you to leave here without hearing it. But the first leadership trait that I talk about that was so key to Ronald Reagan's success that I didn't really have a full appreciation of before was not only what an incredible optimist he was, but how he went about inspiring the country to be optimistic. And so the one and only time when I was doing research on this book, when I fell out of my chair with a belly laugh from laughing so hard, was during Reagan's presidency. He was always talking about how important optimism was. In fact, a lot of biographers say he hated pessimists as much as he hated communists. But he had this favorite story to portray the essence of optimism. And he told it all the time. It became a joke. He told it all the time, but he loved telling it. And when you hear it, you'll say, I get it. That's such a great story. I'm glad I've heard it. You may leave here today and you may repeat it yourself. But the story was that once upon a time, there was a family, and the husband and wife had 2 twin boys who were 10 years old. And one of the boys was a hopeless pessimist. And the other one was just this incredible optimist. The glass is always half full, the glass is always half empty. And so they became so concerned that these boys were so extreme in those 2 directions that they took him to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist talked to both the boys. He said, okay, I've got an experiment here. And so he took the boy who was the pessimist to a room that was filled with shiny new toys. And he said, okay, you stay here for a while and I'll come back. But in the meantime, here are these toys and play with them and have a good time. And for the boy who was the optimist, he took him to a room that was filled with horse manure. And he said, okay, you stay here for a while and I'll come back. So he lets an hour go by. He goes in the room where the pessimistic boy is, and he's crying. He said, what's going on? Here are these toys, and what are you crying? He said, I'm just scared to death that I'm going to break them. So then the psychiatrist goes in the room where the optimist boy, and he's singing, he's laughing, he's found a shovel, he's shoveling, and the psychiatrist said, how could you react to being with horse manure this long the way you are? He said, with all this manure here, there's got to be a pony somewhere. That was Ronald Reagan. That was the way he saw optimism.
That's good.
Isn't that a good story?
That is
I
good.
love that story.
Okay, folks, I think we've gotten to the point, if I can use the mic, gotten to the point where we're ending up. This is the book. It's somewhere out front.
Right outside, yeah.
It really is worth reading. I recommend it highly. Talmage, thank you for coming to Louisville. It's just great to have you here. Come back for a U of L SMU game and see the Ali Center and visit the baseball bat factory and go out to Churchill Downs to see the museum. And we just really appreciate you being with us. And how about a round of applause for our speaker?